I'm Alice Hearing, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll discuss the latest tactical and strategic updates from across Ukraine, the situation in the Donbas region, and the action or inaction of EU leaders in relation to the crisis.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's April 8th, day 44, and today I'm joined by Roland Oliphant, the Telegraph's senior foreign correspondent, Joe Barnes, our Brussels correspondent, and Francis Durnley, our assistant comment editor. I started by asking Roland for the latest updates.
The big thing this morning, of course, is this horrific cluster missile attack on the train station in Kramatorsk, which is one of the main towns in Ukrainian-held East Ukraine. It happened at about 10:30 local time this morning. The mayor says there are about 4,000 people waiting there to evacuate. Local authorities have basically asked as many people as possible to get out of the region because there is likely to be a very large battle in the Donbas in the next week or two. So you have about 4,000 people queuing at the station. About 10:30 this morning, a missile or two missiles dropped a bunch of cluster munitions on them. The current figures are 39 killed, 87 injured as of about an hour ago, or 2 hours ago. That number is, I think the number of deaths is likely to rise because the mayor of Kramatorsk has just told Ukrainian television that the hospitals can't cope. We've got a lot of people with lost limbs. Surgeons are trying to work on several people at a time. That to me says the death toll is going to rise. Almost all of these people, as far as I'm aware, all of the people who've died in this attack are civilians.
What do you think the implications of this are?
Implications? It's to me impossible to imagine that this was some kind of mistake. The evacuation effort from Donbas has been going on for really intensified over the past few days. The railways are absolutely key to that. Everybody, Russian intelligence must have known that there were very large numbers of civilians at the railway station. That railway station I have been through, countless, dozens of times myself. It's just the civilian passenger station. Right? There is no way you can classify that as a military target. There is no way they could not know that was full of civilians. To me, it looks deliberate. And the question is why? Why are you trying to kill civilians? Are you trying to prevent the evacuation because for some reason you want civilians in the region, perhaps as a kind of human shield to kind of deter the Ukrainians from using heavy weaponry in defense, or for some other kind of reason? I don't really understand that logic. Maybe that's a failure of my imagination. But to me, it is simply, as if there was any doubt, it's clear to me that, the Kremlin is pursuing a total war, basically, and the distinction between combatants and civilians is, apparently, from the Russian High Command's point of view, quite blurred.
It's quite clearly, the scenes are on social media absolutely horrendous. But something that we've also seen is that on the side of the missile, it says for the children. Can you explain that, Roland?
Yeah, so everyone will know who's seen pictures from the Second World War. Operators of heavy ordnance tend to write on shells and things, we used to do it, this one's for Adolf kind of thing. Russian propaganda says that Ukrainian fascists kill children. And in fact, any time there's an atrocity or you remember the hospital that was bombed in Mariupol, the drama theatre full of refugees that was bombed in Mariupol, Russian propaganda straight away just blamed that on the Ukrainian fascists. So presumably, from the point of view of the Russian servicemen who were loading that missile, they were taking revenge on the Ukrainian fascists for the children they killed. The irony is, sick irony is, there's at least 4 children in the confirmed fatalities from this attack. So some people will try and frame that as, the Russians are saying we definitely kill children. I would view it as an expression of the kind of parallel reality that Russian propaganda has created.
What exactly is the line that Russia is trying to say? Could you sort of explain a little bit more about the reasons behind saying for the children, but also sort of the wider reasoning?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a narrative that is repeated again and again and again in Russian propaganda, that the Ukrainians shell children, they bomb children. One of the justifications for this war being put out in Russia is the idea that Ukraine is entirely responsible for the 8 years of war that preceded this in the Donbas region. Ukrainians bomb children. Therefore, here is our revenge. And there's also kind of very dark kind of implications. You can't say it's definitely deliberate. I mean, the theatre that was bombed in Mariupol by the Russians, where there were about 300 civilians sheltering at the time, had the word children written in very large letters outside, so it could clearly be seen by Russian jets from the air. The idea was like, well, don't bomb us because this is a civilian target. It was ignored. It's a very macabre, horrible kind of, kind of message, really.
Is this the first instance that we've seen sort of that writing there? Like, it's very clearly sort of Russian propaganda that's actually sort of been written onto the missiles. Is this the first time we've seen that, or have there been other examples? I mean, it's the kind of thing that soldiers write on bombs and missiles, right? This one's for the children. In 2014, you used to see sometimes the separatists on the pro-Russian side writing things like, "This is for Odessa," because there was a big fire in Odessa where a lot of pro-Russian activists were killed, which became a symbol again of so-called Ukrainian fascism, and so on. So it's something that I think happens in every war. It certainly happened in this war. I wouldn't be surprised to see Ukrainian servicemen writing something like, in revenge for Mariupol or something, or this one's for Putin, on their own shells. Francis, do you want to come in on this? I think you've been looking a little bit about Russian propaganda as well.
Yes, I'll just reiterate what Roland was saying, that the writing that's been written on this missile reiterates the power of the propaganda machine within the Russian army and perhaps within Russia more generally. The only other remark I would make on the question of Russia in relation to this is some very interesting comments made by Dmitry Peskov, who's Vladimir Putin's spokesman. He has admitted in an interview that Russia has sustained, quote, significant military losses, calling their deaths a tragedy. This is one of the very few examples that we have seen where Russia has admitted the scale of their losses so far. The numbers, of course, are at this point uncertain, but we know it's many thousands killed. And what we don't know is the extent to which this is being reported in Russia. But I think it's significant that the Russian spokespeople and the Kremlin generally are now having to admit that these losses are taking place. But interestingly, of course, in the same interview, he was not willing to admit to any atrocities committed by the Russian soldiers, instead remarking, quote, "We have significant losses of troops and it's a huge tragedy for us." So clearly, the honesty portrayed by the Kremlin, if that's the right word, only extends so far.
Okay, so just on the back of that, over the past week we've seen what our Defence and Security Editor Tom Nichols has described as reconstitution across Ukraine and the Russians' withdrawal from the capital in the north, and a move to focus on the Donbas. So could one of you, perhaps Roland, describe to us what the Donbas is like, the strength of feeling there as well?
Right, yeah, the Donbas, it's basically a Russian portmanteau word. What would you call it? Anyway, it stands for the Donetsk coal basin, so it's a geological term. It's a coal mining area. It basically means the Luhansk and Donetsk regions of southern and eastern Ukraine. It was where the original war began in 2014. It's quite a heavily Russian-speaking region. It was hit very badly by deprivation with the fall of the Soviet Union. And it was where Russia basically tried to curate a separatist counter-revolution in the wake of the 2014 pro-European Maidan revolution in Kiev. It had a degree of success. It sparked a war, which went on for about a year, ended essentially in a Russian victory, but a bit of a stalemate. And the situation was, okay, there are going to be these two breakaway puppet republics called the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which under an agreement called the Minsk Peace Agreement were meant to be reintegrated into Ukraine. That never happened, basically because Ukraine and Russia had completely different interpretations of how this very short one-page peace deal should be implemented, because the Ukrainians suspected that the real Russian plan was basically to use these regions as a means to euthanize Ukrainian statehood, a way to control Ukraine from within. In the run-up to the current war, one of the key Russian demands was you do this, you do Minsk now, the way we want it done. And the Ukrainians said no, because what you're asking to do is politically impossible, and it's suicide for the government, and it's suicide for Ukrainian sovereignty. So that became, Donbas became the excuse for the current war. I think it's important to emphasize that it's an excuse. If you look at the huge scale of this invasion, the way they went for Kiev at the beginning with a really massed force, the objective, I think, is quite clear, is it's a war of conquest. The idea is to conquer all of Ukraine, perhaps to destroy the entire Ukrainian state. Nonetheless, Donbas remains the official war aim, and the Russians have basically been defeated at Kiev. And as you were saying, they are currently apparently appear to have decided to say, okay, we're going to concentrate on a much smaller, more manageable objective. It's going to be Donbas. We're going to bring the troops we had in the north around Kiev around. We're going to reinforce our forces in the east, and we're going to attempt an enormous pincher movement to cut off and destroy the Ukrainian forces concentrated there. And that's the context of this evacuation that was going on at the station where the missile landed. Ukrainian authorities are trying to get as many civilians out of that area now before the battle really kicks off.
Yes, it's really important to get that context around this horrific attack today. You've also written in today's paper about the Russian paramilitary groups that are going into the area. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Oh, yeah. So this was the reappearance of the Rusic, Task Force Rusic, or the Rusic, what do they call themselves? The Rusic Sabotage, Reconnaissance and Assault Battalion, or something like that. So they're an interesting group. They appeared in 2014 at the beginning of the war, the last war we kind of find ourselves talking about now. When that war began, both sides ended up fielding kind of irregular battalions in one way or another. The Russians ended up sending in their conventional forces as well. This was one of the irregular battalions that showed up on the Russian side. It was founded by a couple of basically self-declared neo-Nazis, white supremacists from St. Petersburg. It recruited from amongst those circles. It became quite notorious in Ukraine. They were involved in a particularly nasty ambush of Ukrainian troops. They've been invested. They're considered terrorists in Ukraine, essentially. They're also basically Nazis. After 2014 and 15, they went off and started showing up in places like Syria, where the Russian government was doing things. Some people think they're part of the Wagner Group, which we've heard of before. This mercenary group that does off-the-book stuff for the Russian government in places like Syria and Libya and the Central African Republic. Other people I've spoken to have said, no, they're probably actually rivals to Wagner. So I'm not sure whether they are part of Wagner or not. It's interesting to see them back. It's not clear who they're answering to, whether they're formally under the command structure of the Russian armed forces or they're formally under the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, which, let's be clear, is ultimately under the control of Moscow. But it's an interesting kind of structural distinction. It also, of course, gives the lie to Russia's claims that this is about denazification, because they've never shown any qualms about employing these kinds of guys.
While we're on the topic of Russian troops, actually, so you reported yesterday that the Russian army is taking steps to avoid Ukrainian propaganda reaching soldiers. Could you tell us a bit more about this? And also, Francis, if you have any more to add on this, please come in.
Yeah, so it's a very intense propaganda war, which makes our job a little bit difficult. So this was based on, I should be clear, and I tried to caveat it quite clearly in the story, this is based on a claim by Ukrainian military intelligence, which itself is heavily engaged in the propaganda war. So they claim, for what it's worth, to have got hold of a document issued by the deputy commander of the Russia's Western Military District, in which it basically says officers in several units, officers at all levels who have encountered resistance from their men, expressing dissatisfaction with the conduct of the, they of course call it a special military operation in Ukraine. I never mentioned the word war. And the upshot of this in this document is basically says, right, issuing an order, pay more attention to your men's psychological moral condition, and restrict their access to the internet via their personal mobiles. The implication seems to be take away their phones. Now, the Ukrainians, of course, crow about this and say, look, this means that, it's working. Kind of information we're putting out is getting through to Russian soldiers. It does chime with other reports we've had. I mean, we've had Britain's GCHQ saying they've had, signal intercept evidence of Russians refusing orders or sabotaging their own vehicles because they don't want to go into battle. I would emphasize that all of these claims and counterclaims are part of the propaganda war, and the Ukrainians are going to make these claims about Russian morale, as the Russians will. If you go on a pro-Russian Telegram channel or something, you'll always see videos of Ukrainian prisoners or Ukrainian corpses, all that kind of counter narrative. But that is one thing that they're putting out at the moment.
If I could just make one comment on that. I think we've spoken many times in this podcast about one of the great known unknowns, which is the extent to which the Russian people are engaging with this propaganda war, and in the sense of believing what the Kremlin is pumping out, is receiving information from the West and other things. I've been following this quite closely, and it would appear that something is occurring within the major cities, and particularly in the sort of more rural pro-Putin parts of Russia, which is a sort of besieged fortress mentality. What I mean by that is it's a phenomenon that we see in war quite often, which is that peoples may well be critical of their leadership in their handling of conflicts, but they see it also as it's better the enemy that they know than the enemy they don't. Namely, it's better that they are in support of their leaders, even if they're critical of their leaders, than foreign powers. And it would appear that there has been an adaptation as people are beginning to realise this is not a short military operation, that this is actually something far more existential and prolonged and protracted. And as a consequence of that, they are now being perhaps more in support of the war than they were actually at the beginning, as the sanctions are beginning to hit. And as a consequence of that, I think that we are perhaps starting to see more of a consolidation of Putin's support within Russia, which clearly goes against what many in the West were hoping initially, which is that actually, as the longer the war goes on, that Russians' capacity and desire to resist sort of Western sanctions would decrease as they begin to feel the pinch. But it would appear that the opposite is taking place, and that is obviously something that we spoke about as being a potential risk of this podcast. On this podcast, that Russia would become more of a North Korea type situation, where the will of the people hardens anti the West as the doors are shut to it. We hope that wouldn't be the case, but it would appear that there is some evidence that it is, and that obviously will have big ramifications for how Putin handles this war in the coming weeks and perhaps months.
That's very interesting that you say that that's actually now been more support. I think a lot of people would almost assume that there would be less, because a lot of Russians, as we know, are really fed up, having been able to kind of get some information across from the West. Roland, do you agree with Francis's point?
Yeah, I mean, people often ask me, like, well, what's happening in Russia? What are the Russians believing and things like that? And the truth is that I lived in Russia until about 5 years ago. I'm not really as, in the loop as I was, but I kind of have that sense as well. I mean, there is a layer of society who are very aware and have VPNs and are frankly appalled by what is happening. And then there's a very large chunk of society who will have swallowed some of the propaganda, that do not underestimate the power of this propaganda. And also, there is a rally around the flag effect when any country goes to war. It happens here, it happens anywhere else. The country is at war, we're under attack. And that narrative, remember, I mean, that's been pushed for years, this idea that the West is out to get us, we're surrounded, we have to stand up to them. This is not something new that they're trying to kind of shovel, get the country behind overnight. They've been pushing that for a very long time. So, yeah, I mean, I would agree that if there was a kind of expectation anywhere that, the Russian people were going to see through the Kremlin's lies and rise up and overthrow the government, I don't see that happening certainly not in the immediate future, even the medium term. But there are interesting historic analogies. I mean, the war in Afghanistan, the Soviet war in Afghanistan in the 80s rumbled on for the best part of a decade. And it didn't itself bring down the Soviet Union, but it definitely contributed to, over the years, the sense of mistrust and disillusionment, and so on and so forth. It is a slow burn, I think, this kind of thing.
Earlier this week, I spoke to Sophia Yan, the Telegraph's China correspondent. Last time she was on the podcast, she explained that people in China weren't aware of what was going on, the influx of disinformation, and also that Xi Jinping was close to Putin. I started by asking Sophia what's happened since then.
Well, the last time I was speaking about this, it was still really early days in terms of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, and China was working on figuring out how best to respond. Beijing kicked pretty quickly into gear, and what you've seen in the last couple of weeks is really a flurry of diplomacy, a lot of phone calls, significant meetings occurring between China and many other nations. So let me just run down this timeline. One day after Russia invaded Ukraine, Chinese leader Xi Jinping had a call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Then on March 8th, he has a call with French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. 10 days later, Xi has a call with Joe Biden. A week after that, on March 25th, Xi speaks with Boris Johnson. On that same exact day, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi lands in India for a surprise visit. This is the most high-level official visit to Delhi since tensions rose after border clashes in 2020. So this is an important one. And this is interesting because China and India often are at odds, but India actually abstained from the UN vote early on. Last Friday, April 1st, China and the EU held its first summit. It was virtual. This is the first time the two sides have met in more than 2 years. And then just this week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. So in all of this, note that Xi has spoken with Putin, but still has had no engagement with his counterpart in Ukraine, with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. So it's really interesting. Clearly, China's trying to send messages out, trying to work on its global reputation, trying to disrupt ties with the West in all of these meetings.
Yeah, so that's obviously really, really significant now, because when you first spoke to us, it did not sound like anything like that was happening at all. Do you think, what do you think that means? Has China changed its stance, or do you think it's just trying to protect its own interests?
China's absolutely working to protect its own interests. Everything Beijing does is always in its national self-interest. So first, in all of these meetings, China's trying to continue messaging its apparent neutrality, even though obviously Beijing's actions and how Chinese state media, as we've discussed before, have portrayed the war in Ukraine, have trended on side with Russia, down to parroting Russian disinformation. I mean, you see the phrases sometimes word for word from what the Russians have said and what the Chinese are saying, or what is in Chinese state media. It's also an attempt to massage various relationships to try to repair China's global reputation, which has suffered over its refusal to denounce Russia. It really amounts to a great deal of waffling. This is what we're observing in terms of this very checkered response out of Beijing. And the third thing that China's trying to do is really trying to keep on keeping on, attempting to do business as usual. This China-EU summit that was held last Friday, this is, again, the first time that the two sides have met in more than 2 years. But both were really talking past each other. The EU Foreign Affairs Chief, Josep Borrell, he described it as a, quote, dialogue of the deaf. He said, "We could not talk about Ukraine a lot, and we did not agree on anything else. China cannot pretend to be a great power, but close its eyes or cover its ears when it comes to a conflict that obviously makes it uncomfortable." So basically, China refused to talk about Ukraine and instead tried to focus on other issues, which at the moment the West doesn't want to focus on. Ties between the EU and China were already suffering, same with relations between China and the US and the UK. And with the EU, China's wanted to get this investment agreement back on track, but that got scuppered after coordinated Western sanctions against China over human rights concerns. Then China slapped the EU, the US, others, the UK as well, with counter sanctions. So ties were already on the rocks, and China's trying to figure out a way to still build on those relations to try to improve things without dealing with the Ukraine issue, which of course right now is not something that many countries want to be thinking about. Right now, the war in Ukraine, it's a crisis that the world is facing each other. So the fact that China's talking past the West is a huge problem. It's really frustrating for those on the receiving end. You know, my understanding in speaking with sources is that in all these high-level calls that Xi has held with leaders in the US, the UK, France, and Germany, that China's continued to make clear that it's not going to come out publicly against Russia despite all the pressure to do so.
Do you think that there will definitely be no sanctions then from China against Russia at all in the future, even if the West continues to pressure?
Sanctions from China against Russia are really pretty unlikely. China and Russia have for years developed a strategic relationship. They're not allies in the Western sense. They're not buddy-buddy on everything, and they're not always going to stick their necks out for each other. But they are two authoritarian nations who really see eye to eye. They want to create a new international world order that is beneficial to them, one that's not led by the U.S. And so because of that, China's not going to say that Russia's doing something terrible necessarily. And also you have to consider the fact that very likely from Xi Jinping's perspective, he's thinking the long-term strategy here. If China in the future wants to move on Taiwan, he's not going to want Putin to come out, or whoever's in charge in Russia to come out and say that China shouldn't be doing that on Taiwan, right? There's this sort of like a gentleman's agreement, shall we say, that he's relying on or hoping that he can bank on in the future. So if China's going to say or denounce Russia at this point and say that Moscow shouldn't be doing this, that it needs to pull out, this is something that if the tables were turned, I mean, she's not going to want to deal with that sort of situation.
So in that sense, what are the chances that Xi could persuade Putin anyway? Can he influence him in terms of trying to either end the war or sort of just give in to what the West want in some capacity? Do you think that's possible?
This is a really interesting point to discuss. If any leader in the world could stand a chance at trying to get Putin to listen, it probably would be Xi Jinping. But that's a risk. First, Putin isn't going to want to appear weak, trying to bend to someone else's request. That's not likely to happen, right? He likes the strongman image, as does Xi himself. Xi, if he does that, that means he would be almost siding with the West, the democratic West, which goes against, politically speaking, everything China believes in. And what if Putin didn't listen? Then Xi Jinping would look like a fool. So these are all challenges as to whether or not China would ever consider doing something like that. And again, this goes back to the point I made earlier about everything being in China's national self-interest. What good would it do China? In what way could it benefit China to do something like that? I mean, there are very few pros, really, to that question. So because of that, it's very unlikely that Xi Jinping would even give it a shot or even be entertaining the idea.
What do you think he would do? Because clearly the war in Ukraine and the sanctions from the West on China as well is not beneficial for Xi. So what can he do to influence Putin one way, or what can he do to sort of make it easier for him?
I think we're seeing that now. There's an attempt to try to have this holding pattern and to try to only talk about the issues that China wants to talk about without addressing the elephant in the room, which is obviously the war in Ukraine. There are some ways that China could benefit. One big question is whether or not China would take this opportunity to snap up assets on the cheap, particularly energy resources. China is a country of 1.4 billion people. This is, it takes a lot of oil and gas, it takes a lot of water, it takes a lot to keep this place running. And there was always a question of whether or not China would try to shore up energy resources with Russia at this moment when Russia is a little bit on the down and out. There's some exploration, it seems, of these possibilities by state-owned companies in China, but so far nothing quite yet inked for real. China seems to be really taking its time in terms of picking and choosing how it wants to deal and respond to the situation at the moment. Russia is also turning to China for new suppliers on a range of items. Because of Western sanctions over Ukraine, they've cut Russia out of global banking messaging systems, over international payment cards like Visa and MasterCard. Even Apple Pay has had to cut ties. So Russian banks, for instance, are scrambling for new options. And so they're exploring possibilities with Chinese companies. So in that sense, in the long term, this could mean that Russia becomes more reliant on China, which Moscow probably doesn't want, but this is the way the cards have been dealt. So this potentially gives China a free remit also to try to build on its relationship with Russia and increase its influence over Russia, and maybe then also move in, and this is very long term, to Central Asia to increase its influence there. I mean, those countries were part of the Soviet Union. And so there's always been a tussle between China and Russia for power there. I mean, this is a chance potentially for China to gain more influence there.
So that's the long term. So in that sense, then, what can we expect from the short term?
Right now, from Beijing, this is a politically important year. Chinese leader Xi is, near the end of this year, going to try to sit for an unprecedented third term. He scrapped term limits. He could stay in power potentially indefinitely. So right now, what China wants is absolute stability. They need political stability, but the economy is on the decline. Growth is an issue. It's, the pandemic is still a concern. Shanghai, a city of 26 million, is under lockdown right now, as well as other parts of China. COVID is running rampant here. These are all major challenges. So right now, Beijing is going to probably try really, really hard to just keep everything as quiet as possible. That has something to do, likely, with all these meetings that China has had, these phone calls, just trying to at least have some engagement to a certain extent, because what they need right now is to ensure that nothing crazier than what has already happened happens, because of this power, this situation where Xi wants to stay in power. I mean, he needs to make sure that he can do that and that this transition will happen smoothly.
Just moving on, we've also got Joe Barnes, who is our Brussels correspondent. Hi, Joe. In the light of Boris Johnson meeting Olaf Scholz this afternoon, you've reported that Scholz is the main roadblock to increased sanctions. Do you see this shifting?
Hello. So when it comes to EU sanctions, there's a massively shifting landscape about how hard and how far some countries want to go. There are some, the Poles, the Baltics, those that actually have experience of kind of living close to kind of the Russian threat, are willing basically to kind of bite their own nose off to spite their enemy. Whereas those like Germany aren't willing to go as hard and as fast in punishing Russia for the war in Ukraine. So when we reported that Germany was the main roadblock, that was the Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki speaking, and he is basically one of the harder kind of nosed EU leaders when it comes to sanctions, and he is quite rightly frustrated with the Germans, because they're blocking any serious kind of implications when it comes to gas, sanctions on Russian gas exports. But what we have got now is we've got a EU ban on Russian coal exports, and that's going to come into play in 120 days. So basically EU countries have 4 months to get their kind of priorities and get their supplies sorted out before that comes in. And what we will have next time the EU ramps up its sanctions is likely a sanction on oil exports, which the Germans were once opposed to, but now they have kind of seen what's happened in terms of these atrocities outside of Kiev, and now they're willing to actually go a bit harder and faster to basically ramp up pressure on Moscow, on the Kremlin, to pull out and come to a peace arrangement. So that's where we are on that. But what we probably won't see anytime soon is gas, because that is more controversial, and the Germans have basically said it will plunge their economy into a steep recession if they are forced to turn off the taps there.
Is it just Germany that is doing this, or are there other European countries that are also reluctant?
Publicly, we know that Hungary have also said they will veto a further ban on Russian gas and oil. And that is basically because Budapest is seen as the closest capital to Moscow when it comes to wanting to form ties. And Viktor Orban, he was personally praised by Vladimir Putin after winning the election recently. And he's spoken out about having to basically work with Putin and form close bonds with him, business bonds with him.
Just how reliant is the EU on Russian fuel, and how much has the EU spent on Russian fuel with those countries in mind?
So there was quite an interesting comment from Joseph Borrell, who's the EU's foreign affairs chief, in the European Parliament earlier this week. And he said since the invasion started on February the 24th, the EU had sent around 1 billion euros a day to Russia for energy payments, and only had sent 1 billion in aid to Ukraine for weapons and other such assistance. So that kind of highlights the dependence of the EU on when it comes to kind of Russian hydrocarbons, and basically what makes it difficult for the EU to kind of wean itself off of these fuels that are funding Putin's war machine. So that's when you kind of break it down into figures like that, 35 times more money has been sent from the EU to Russia than it has been sent from the EU to Ukraine, is rather incredible.
So the EU then is extremely reliant in that sense, although you have said that Germany potentially is going to go the other way. But how realistic is a full embargo? Because Kiev yesterday called for a full embargo on Russian gas and oil. So how realistic is it really?
It's hard to say at the moment. So the EU foreign ministers are likely to discuss the prospect of an oil ban when they meet next week in Brussels. But ramping that up to gas is going to be very tricky. So the EU imports 40% of its gas from Russia. And that number increases differently. So in Germany, for instance, about 50% of its gas comes from Russia. So the EU countries and the EU have said, like Britain and like the US, they're going to wean themselves off of Russian hydrocarbons over the next years. Germany's pledged to do it by mid-2024. But that prospect of like these short, sharp sanctions coming in on a full energy embargo are probably highly unlikely, just because when it comes to EU level, you need to have all 27 nations in acceptance of the policy, basically. So you'll get some countries, Poland, for instance, has announced a unilateral ending of the use of Russian fossil fuels. So Britain, not in the EU anymore, but has done very, very similar in this. There are other countries that are doing it themselves, but on an EU level, I think we're going to find it very hard to get an agreement when it comes to banning oil, gas and coal.
Francis or Roland, do either of you have any points on this?
I would just comment on how remarkable it is that we've got the Chancellor of Europe's biggest economy coming to Britain and effectively the Prime Minister of Britain offering to reduce his dependence on Moscow's energy exports. I mean, it is quite a remarkable event and significant and quite humiliating, really, if you think about it in those terms. I think it's just worth saying and emphasising the naivety of the German response to Russia for the last 20 or more years. Effectively, I think that historians of the future will say that effectively it was one of the great geopolitical failures of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, that this has, by being so reliant on Russian fuel, that Germany has effectively enabled a dictator on the European doorstep. And because be under no illusions, I don't think it would have been possible for Russia to have engaged militarily with Ukraine were Putin not certain that he would have this reliable source of income from Germany and other European countries. It is a huge failure and has essentially restored elements of fascism to Europe. Of course, you can comment on whether that was predictable or not and the extent of the Russian responsibility for that, but ultimately it has been enabled by a German energy and security policy that has fundamentally failed. And there has to be a realignment as a consequence of that. There are signs that is taking place, but the strength of German feeling amongst the elites seems to be weaker now than perhaps it was in following the initial shock of the invasion. So it'll be very interesting to follow this longer term.
Absolutely. And I also think that kind of brings us on to the reaction of other EU leaders. So today, Ursula von der Leyen and Joseph Borrell are heading into Kyiv. What do you think is the significance of that, Francis, Roland, or Joe?
It's the first time so in the context of the world kind of stage, the EU leaders, so Ursula von der Leyen is given kind of a head of state kind of role, and she attends NATO summits, she attends G7 summits. So this is a really big deal. This is essentially a head of a country, or head of 27 countries, going into the Ukrainian capital to the Ukrainian president and kind of message her support. So the European Parliament's president has recently been, but she's Roberta Metsola, but she's kind of seen as a bit of a joke figure, not as much as a political heavyweight as what it would be as, say, for instance, a Boris Johnson or a Joe Biden, or in this case, Ursula von der Leyen, going to kind of, share some warm words and voice some support. And they've gone in today with a message that the EU is going to agree to another 500 million euros in funding for kind of Ukrainian weapons and helping the armed forces in their fight against the Russians.
Francis?
Just whilst we're on the subject of international relationships with Russia, it was very noteworthy yesterday that the UN General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. Symbolic more than anything else, I think. The Human Rights Council has been dismissed for many months now as being largely a joke when you have the Iranians appearing on it, who are involved in such suppressive measures in their own country. So it's less interesting for the significance of Russia being suspended and more for those who voted against suspension and also for abstaining. So against abstention was higher was much higher than it was following the initial invasion. So whilst 93 members voted in favour of Russia's suspension, there were 58 abstentions and 24 that voted against. Amongst those that voted against, you had obviously Russia, North Korea, Iran, Algeria, China, very significantly, Kazakhstan and Syria. Vietnam too, but amongst the abstentions, I would say are more concerning. So you have India, Pakistan, Qatar, many African nations, Brazil. These would not be countries that you would necessarily predict as appearing on that list, and the fact that they are there is, I think, something very concerning for the long-term geopolitical realignment that is taking place against West and East. So I just wanted to draw attention to that because I think it will be very, very relevant considering matters long-term.
Roland?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think this, like I worked quite a bit in South Africa over the past few years, and I've had colleagues like sending me the kind of stuff that's showing up, the kind of narrative down there. I mean, quite kind of sympathetic to the Russian point of view, to the point I'm like kind of, my jaw hits the floor and say, well, that's not true, and that's not true, and that's not true. But yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a case to be made for the West to wake up to attitudes outside of the West, wake up to the fact that Russia is a global power with global reach that has the capacity to launch a land war in Europe. And going back to the point about German naivety, I think the Germans probably have been a bit naive, but they are not alone. Look, I mean, Britain is in the kind of somewhat comfortable position there of being able to say, well, we don't take that much Russian gas. No, but we've taken a lot of their money. And if you speak to, kind of diplomats from the Baltic states, Poland, places like that, real dismay at the complacency that the British establishment has shown about those issues over several years. I think one of the big challenges of this crisis is for Western governments to kind of, I think, wake up and get serious about the way the world is. Quite honestly, just put it blunt. I mean, that sounds quite kind of, man in the pubish, but I think it almost boils down to that.
Francis, you've actually been in Paris recently. What do you think about France's reaction? Since we're talking about leaders, and was there anything about sort of feelings on the ground as well about people you spoke to?
Yes, so I've just returned from Paris for a 4-day trip there, and spoke to several senior journalists out there as well as just talking to people and noting the feelings on the ground. So the election is this Sunday, the first round, and it is expected that as a consequence of that, Emmanuel Macron, the current incumbent, will obviously be going through to the next round, and it's expected that Marine Le Pen, who was his rival in the last election, will be his other rival in the second round. The significance, I think, of this vote can't be underestimated in terms of the impact that this will have potentially on Europe, because Macron has been trying to be the bridge between Russia and the European Union powers. He was, of course, going to Putin until the final hours of the war and since. To try and persuade Putin not to invade. He obviously failed in that. We've been very critical here in Britain of Macron's naivety in doing so, but actually, interestingly, talking to journalists on the ground, they were saying that it's actually played quite well in France, not only because it clearly appears that Macron was assuming a role that other European leaders had not done, but also because there is a sort of deep-rooted feeling in France that they are already a sort of second-rate power due to their experiences in the 20th century, and so naturally they are trying to re-establish some of France's prominence on the continent, particularly given Britain's decision to leave the European Union. That obviously filled some space there that France feels that it can now assume in terms of the leadership. Although, ironically, of course, Britain has arguably had a much firmer and more successful policy towards the Ukraine crisis than France has. So that's quite interesting, I think. But another reason this is so significant is, of course, Marine Le Pen has in the past been more favourable, I would say, towards Vladimir Putin in the way that sort of some right-wing political figures across Europe, including in Britain, have. She has praised his sort of consistency at home on putting his own nation first, his criticism of, I suppose we would articulate it as sort of the woke far left agenda, and things like that. And so one could argue, as some commentators have, that actually the two most significant events that are taking place this week are the one, at least from the perspective of Vladimir Putin, is one, what's taking place in the Donbas and whether he can have military successes there before May 9th, which is the military parade traditionally in Russia, but also the French election. Because if Marine Le Pen were able to cause an upset, then clearly that would be more favourable to Putin than perhaps Macron being there. So that's very important. As well, I think on the energy point, it's worth saying that France has not made the scale of the mistakes that Germany has. They are not as reliant on Russian gas, but they've continued a policy of nuclear power plants, which Germany stopped after the Fukushima incident several years ago. So they are not as reliant on Russian oil and gas, although they are still paying for some. But they have other ties with Russia that are longer term, which of course is why Macron is doing this. So it's all going to be a very, very significant month, this, for not only for France, but also for what its implications of that election will have on Europe generally and on the Ukraine crisis. And one just last comment that's very much anecdotal from my own perspective, but I was just walking around Paris and I assumed that what they have in Paris is something that you don't have here in Britain, which is sort of particular, I suppose, poster places where posters relating to the election are posted and are put up by the candidates. And I predicted rather naively that you would expect to perhaps see Macron in Paris having his posters untouched and perhaps see Eric Zemmour's, the far-right candidates, and Marine Le Pen's posters torn down. But actually, it was very consistent. What you would see walking around is that either all of the posters would be up or all of them would be torn down. It wasn't as if one candidate over another seemed to be more hated or more vilified in the areas in which I was walking around. And I thought that would not be the case here. And perhaps it just speaks to the fact that the cost of living crisis that is being affected in Paris, which is and the wider France, which has been really the fundamental issue of this election, clearly has not led to Marine Le Pen being vilified as she has in previous elections. And that is potentially significant. So there could well be an upset in France, but it would be a real upset, because I think most people think that Macron will pull it off. But so that would be, I'd say, the lay of the land in France as it is at this moment. But things can change, obviously, very, very quickly.
Thank you so much, Francis. Just moving on as we're heading towards the end now, we do have a question from a listener, Kathy, and I'm just going to read it out. So she says, in today's Telegraph, there's a story describing the forced conscription of Ukrainian men into the Russian army. Apart from the obvious horror of this, I'm wondering if this is a good strategy by Russia. Wouldn't conscripted soldiers try to sabotage equipment and lower the morale of Russian soldiers by telling them the truth of the invasion? Do you have anything to add on this? How would you, Roland? Let's go for you.
Yes, I was just listening to a briefing by the Ukrainian governor of Ukrainian-controlled Donbas just before I came on here, and he was saying the same thing. He was saying there's reports of, especially from Mariupol, the Russians have been trying to force civilians who want to leave Mariupol to go to either the so-called Donetsk People's Republic or to Russia, rather than let them go towards Ukrainian territory, and men in particular. And he said the Ukrainians law enforcement has confirmed multiple cases of this, of men being forcibly drafted. He didn't say into the regular Russian military, into the formations of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. It speaks to a number of things. One is perhaps a shortage of manpower. You need people. That is not that unusual in a European land war, to forcibly conscript people or try to conscript people who might have some kind of sympathy for your cause. Anyway, I wouldn't actually exclude that. I know Mariupol quite well, and definitely the initial kind of pro-Russian sentiment that was there in 2014 had definitely kind of died down over the years, and most of those people had left. But I wouldn't exclude there were a few people who, harbour some kind of sympathy and might have joined up. Certainly, the Ukrainians themselves, I think recently announced that they're arming, Russian prisoners of war who've agreed to change sides. So that can kind of happen. The third thing, about them being recruited into the armed forces of the Donetsk People's Republic. These guys are reportedly being used as cannon fodder. It's pretty grim. The so-called DNR army, made of volunteers and recently conscripted men, poorly trained, poorly equipped, and according to the reports that I understand, kind of thrown into battle almost literally as cannon fodder. It's not a formation you want to be in.
It does paint quite a grim picture. Francis or Joe, do you have thoughts as well?
I think on this it kind of it paints a picture of how far the Russians are willing to go, and the kind of these stories coming out of Ukraine are really helpful because it helped kind of put pressure on Western leaders, and they kind of to actually see the reality because to some they have turned a blind eye to it. There's lots of questions around kind of hawkish member states who are like keen on security. Why didn't the EU or the UK or the US move ahead with sanctions before the invasion? Why wasn't there a deterrent to basically stop Putin from crossing the border? So it's stories like this, and the stories and the videos and pictures we saw in Butcher that actually kind of forced the EU to move, forced other Western leaders to say, okay, we need to send more support to Ukraine, we need to send more support to Zelensky, we need to crack down harder on kind of Russian money and Russian influence in the West. So all of these stories coming out are actually really quite helpful for the Ukrainian causes as such, because it does kind of actually wake people up to the quite grim reality that we have a major conflict on our continent for the first time in decades.
I would only add, Alice, that I think, again, speaks to the dire straits as well that the Russian army is in. You don't have conscripts that, for the reasons that our listener has highlighted, you don't have conscripts in an army unless you can absolutely help it from a foreign country. But noteworthy, I think, that both the Germans and the Russians did that during the Second World War when, they were both under serious threat. It just speaks to me of a sort of desperation, really, because there are so many risks attached to it.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, and also thank you, Kathy, for your question. We do really encourage questions on this podcast, and if you want to ask a question, just email podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. So just before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts on what we've discussed about today's attack in the Donbas and also any EU diplomacy? Let's start with Joe.
So my final thoughts is the EU is moving, and it's not particularly keen as being as a whole entity, a whole organisation. It's not keen on being seen as soft on Russia at the moment, especially as kind of these like really graphic and kind of horrifying and heinous atrocities are unmasked. So we are going to see more movement, and we will see a sixth package of sanctions which will come up soon, and I do think they will slowly move towards cutting out Russian energy products, so gas, oil, and coal eventually. But it's going to be quite an internal battle. But you'd think that kind of good will prevail over evil eventually.
Roland?
I mean, two things. One is, on that question of help, I saw this morning that it's now confirmed that Slovakia, I think, has sent S-300 air defences. I think. I saw on Twitter just before this started. If that's true, that means Europe is finally providing the thing the Ukrainians have been begging for, which is high altitude, medium altitude air defense, close the skies. And remember, the message from the Ukrainians is, we need this now. We do not have time for you to sit around umming and ahhing and deciding what's politically expedient and, we need consensus here or a 27-country bloc. The message from the Ukrainians is there is going to be an absolutely enormous pivotal battle for the Donbas region. We're talking about something on the scale of, the Battle of Kursk in 1943 or something. That's the kind of message we're getting about what's going to happen there in the next couple of weeks. And the Ukrainians are absolutely begging for hardware, more weapons, more ammunition now to tip the baton. That battle, actually, what we were saying about, kind of recruiting prisoners of war and things like this, and the desperation that reflects, this battle, this war, is existential for Ukraine. I think it is also existential for Vladimir Putin's regime. I think if he loses this war, And there are lots of ways in which he can sell a kind of partial defeat as a victory and so on and so forth. It's not clear cut. But if he suffers a genuine, heavy, serious defeat that he can't really sell, then he's in trouble, and he's going to fight very hard. So things are going to get much worse and much more violent, I think, before they get better.
Thank you, Roland. And Francis?
We haven't spoken about NATO today, and I think I just will point listeners to an interesting article in The Atlantic by former President Bill Clinton. We've spoken previously on this podcast that one of the main charges against the West has been about NATO expansion into the former Soviet territories after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. And President Clinton writes really a defence of his policy on NATO expansion, obviously not into Ukraine, but into the many other countries that surrounded it. And I thought there's some very interesting thoughts in it that are worth reflecting on. So he comments on the fact that he met with Yeltsin 18 times when he was president and Putin 5 times, and that those were just 3 short of the entire US leaders meetings, US Army leaders meetings from 1943 to 1991. So he argues that this idea that Russia was somehow ignored or disrespected or tried to forcibly be isolated from the international community is not true. And he actually spoke about Putin about bringing Russia potentially into NATO. So that's an interesting point. And but another quote that he makes in the article is from Anna Applebaum. And I think this is just a thoughtful point in which to finish, that if NATO perhaps had not expanded into some of these former Soviet territories, then the battle that we're seeing currently taking place in Ukraine may well be taking place in East Germany right now. That already there would have been an attempt to steamroller through those countries and to rebuild either the former Soviet Union or part of this imperialist sort of Tsarist Russia that we know that Putin idolizes so much. The very fact that we did expand NATO has meant that he has only had one option in which he can try and achieve such an expansion, and that is in the Ukraine. So I just think it's a thought-provoking article in which I would point people towards, because one reads it and immediately thinks, actually, yes, this is an interesting point, that as much as one can criticise the policy of Western expansion, there's many other arguments why it's actually been a good thing.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings you stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us, like Kathy, by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells, Giles Gear, and on Twitter, Sophie Coe.